How many of you work at a tech company? Okay, that's really good. How many of you work in cloud services? Okay, good chunk. How many of you market directly to a developer? Okay, so hopefully for those of you that do, you get something that you can take back to work. Even if not, it becomes something that's interesting for you guys to get into, as it's a hugely growing and very profitable space. So the way I'm going to do this is I'll talk a little bit about how I ended up in this role, what is developer go-to-market, and how you should think about it. And then I'll show you some things that I've been doing since I joined Snowflake about a year ago. Just had a launch last week where we announced something that was big in terms of how we're changing the way the platform needs to be seen by different audiences. And so I'll show you guys some of the things that were considered as part of that. The way my career got shaped was I was a consultant at IBM, and so I used to sell how do you do big data back in 2013, right? And so people were thinking about how do we do this, and everything was on-prem, right? If we think about computers inside your business, it was all about that. But I learned how things get purchased, all the processes that need to happen, how many people you need to convince in order to buy anything. And so it was a really good way to understand the enterprise, which is where every sort of like SaaS application developer tool wants to make it in, because that's when you start getting like huge contracts, reliable revenue, and all of that stuff. So that was a great way to get started. Then I went to grad school and spent a summer at VMware. VMware at a very high level, what it does is it virtualizes computers so that many people can use a set of on-prem clusters for different things. It's almost like you create a private cloud inside your on-prem. And my project here was VMware wanted to move into the cloud, so I had to do research on like what companies they should partner and invest in. So I worked with the COO on coming up with a strategy for that as part of my summer internship. And so it really gave me a good position to see like what's hot, what's not, what's going to be cool in the next couple of years. And so then I ended up joining a company called Confluent, which it provides, there's an open source software called Apache Kafka, and then we sell it as a managed service. What that means is that the way you could install something and you would have to manage everything around it, like if there's software updates, you have to do them yourself. With our version of how you run the company, you wouldn't have to do any of that. And the interesting thing about this one is that it had sort of like this product-led growth strategy, which is we let developers adopt the open source free version, and then we sell them up on the managed version. But at the same time, we were trying to sell hundreds of $1,000 million contracts to their managers and organizations that wanted something bigger. And so you need to bridge those two. And it's actually really hard, but it's sort of like the golden ticket. Companies that figure out how to do this end up doing well on the market. One of them that's sometimes fairly known is like MongoDB. MongoDB is really good at this, and it's one of those that did it in a very good way. Confluent and others are sort of following the steps of companies like MongoDB. And so now I'm at Snowflake. Snowflake at a very high level is known for just a place where you put your data in the cloud, and you can do it across all three clouds. That's sort of like the value prop, and then you can process all that data in something that most people know as a data warehouse. But a data warehouse is only for SQL users. SQL is just a programming language like Python and R and Java and all these other things. But Snowflake only had SQL. It was great at SQL, but it means that there's this huge market outside that we didn't have access to. And so now we're going after developers of all kinds. My focus is the data scientist, the data engineer, the ML engineers. And so what exactly is developer go-to-market? And why is that important? Well, in a sales cycle, you could be talking to the decision maker, and you think you're going to make the sale, but at the end of it, very likelihood of that if you haven't talked to the developer that's actually going to end up using the tool, you may lose that sale. Why? Because they're like, this doesn't work for me, it doesn't work into my workflow, I don't like the way this works, too complicated to use, et cetera, et cetera. And it's almost like if your manager told you, hey, this is your new thing that is better than Excel. And you're so used to using Excel for simple things that you do on a day-to-day basis, why would I need this extra thing that's more complicated that you decided to pay for that is not useful for my job, right? And it sort of happens with tons of different tools that they need to use. And so it's really important that as part of the sales cycle, you get the buy-in of the developers the same way that you would of the executives. And many times it's most important to get their buy-in first so that when they talk to their manager, it's like, okay, if my team wants this, then it's my manager as a role, my role as a manager, I want to get them that tool. And so it's a much easier conversation if you go that way. So it's almost like product-led growth for developers. For those of you, so this is going to be a good one for those that are maybe not as involved in like tech or cloud services. what exactly is a developer? And so think of like the Amazon website and how that runs as a way to think about like who are the developers that I would be talking to. So at a very high level, the first is sort of like everyone in the back end, which I call infrastructure developers. These are the teams that are running, call it the virtual computers that make everything run, right? There's a ton of what we call infrastructure that makes things happen, where the data is stored, where the data is processed, where the data is cached, where the code is stored, where the code is kept. There's all these other things that you need to put together in order to build this like infrastructure on which, on top of that, then things like data devs can work on top of that. So then this is where you have, and I call the data devs the teams that turn data into insights. And so for example here, there's titles like the data engineer. They're really good at getting tons of data, munging it, and putting it in a place that's clean so that analysts and data scientists and other people can use it. So that's what the data engineer does. Data scientists then create machine learning models and data science statistical models and solutions like predictive models like the ones that you would see on a website. So behind that little box on the left that has your recommendations, there's a team of data engineers and data scientists that are turning all the data that you're giving Amazon around your purchases, your history, your credit card information, and they're turning that into that little box. And the team that's actually creating that box and all the other boxes that you see around it is what I call the application developers. So they're building sort of like the front end, the things that you see in your applications. And this could be desktop application, your mobile application, web applications, right? And all of these work hand in hand together. Without one or the other, you can't really get a good, successful product. And so companies are moving into this digital world. They care about all of them, making sure that they're super productive. And so there's going to be a ton of tools that want to be part of this stack. So when did this get started? How many of you live in the Bay Area by any chance? Okay. Have you ever seen the 101 sign on the left? Maybe. It used to be, it's changed location. So the story behind this is, if you ever go to the Bay Area, all you see on the highway between San Francisco and San Jose is developer tool ads. There's like databases, cloud services, all this other stuff, right? You go to different cities like this one, different set of ads, right? Completely different set of ads. Over there, it's always like targeting to the developers, right? Because it's such a big community on the Bay Area. But in 2015, there was a company called Twilio, which maybe you guys know, but you guys use all the time, which is anytime you do like a text message to get a service, like you have to verify your account, high likelihood that Twilio is running that in the back end for your bank or someone else like that. Or like when you're trying to connect HBO to a new TV, where you have to like go and type in your name, and then you get this text message, and then you put it in there. All that, Twilio is helping that, so that the developer at HBO doesn't have to create a whole system around integrating with like AT&T, T-Mobile, and all those service providers. Twilio sort of takes care of that, packages it, and sells it to developers so that they can just integrate it into an application. And so this is where like all these developer tools come in, is they take away work from developers in a way that makes it more efficient, so they focus on their core business, right? So the HBO developer is focused on, I want to make the best video streaming app. I don't want to make the best SMS connectivity app, right? And so you take some of that burden away, and that's why it's so valuable to do that. And so this happened in 2015, right before Twilio IPO'd, and was one of the great IPOs before everything that's happened in the market. But what's interesting about this story was sort of the go-to-market that they came up with back then. So in 2015, Twilio was like, how do we explain what we do, right? Like, the developers know what we do, but we can't explain to the executives what exactly do we do. So their campaign was called Ask Your Developer, right? It's such a complex product that I can't explain it myself, so I'm gonna let the end user explain it to them. It worked really great, great company, grew a ton. And sort of at the same time, happened something super interesting, which is anybody that's ever worked with a developer or worked with someone, there's a company called GitHub. And this is where you put your code. So when a developer writes code, to make sure that they don't lose it and everybody else has the same copy, they do something which is I check it into GitHub. So I just give it to GitHub. They take care of making sure that that code is visible to the people that should have access to it. That same year, Microsoft, one of the bigger developer companies, right, with Microsoft Azure Cloud, decided to integrate with GitHub. And so I call this 2015 year sort of like the pivotal moment that changed sort of this idea of, hey, someone needs to get really good at marketing to developers because they have a lot of power, right? As we saw, 60% of them can say, I will buy or not buy your tool. And so it sort of shifted the way, and it's not the IBM way anymore that's successful, where you have 3 different account teams, going out to lunch, having golf. Yeah, that works. Eventually, you have to do this on a product-led growth once you have to nurture a really large account. There's nothing wrong with that. But the IBM way doesn't work at all if you're just a startup that's getting started and you're trying to make your way in this super, super saturated market. And why do I say that? So in 2016, it was easy to just say, hey, I don't need to explain my product, let someone else explain it, because there weren't that many what I call developer tool platforms. Yes, probably we're already in the hundreds, but now we're probably like tens of thousands of tools that exist to solve these things. And so what companies realized is that PMM becomes sort of like the foundational go-to-market hire for any of these companies. Because the first thing that you have to do is, one, explain what you do, because you can't just let the developers explain the things anymore. Otherwise, they could be explaining somebody else's tool better than they do yours. And the second thing is, right, the level of competition is much higher because the stakes keep getting higher and higher. The way I think about sort of this growth and the market growth in here is I always look at AWS. AWS to me was sort of like the magic company that in AWS meaning Amazon Web Services, right, which is the cloud services as part of the Amazon.com brand. They started early on in like 2006, I think was when the first time that one of the first services was launched. But 10 years later, they're making, it's a business that was worth $12 billion. Where we look at it now from last year, $62 billion, right? Even as all these other companies were still coming into the market, AWS managed to grow at a 31+% year over year. And all this stuff to me was amazing, right? As I was learning across going all these companies, I'm like, man, this thing is crazy. Cloud is really a great place to go work at and really build a career. And so that's what I started to do. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit as to like, hey, if you want to join one of these companies, there's a lot of market growth. Some of these companies can grow 10x, 20x within a few couple years. So there can be great outcomes in your careers, great experience, fast pace, even if you work at one of these for only a couple years. But really, even as you think about your roles, maybe your end user is not the developer, is not a developer, but it may be someone that might have a little bit of a technical mind. So how do I think about really getting to them? And so I'll sort of give you my view on all this stuff. So I actually drew this so that it wouldn't look perfect because, sorry. The thing about developer marketing is you don't want things to be perfect. You want things to feel genuine. You want to feel like you are talking to your end user, like you're not trying to BS them. And so that's the most important thing. And, sorry. Too much, too fast. The way I think about this is through like a 3-step cycle message, which is, let's say you come up with a messaging doc, right? PMS, this is what you're really good at. Come up with your messaging doc. Sorry. To me, the core of it then is the community. So who's the community? The community is your developers. So these are the people that are building the code. But it's not just your developers. There's this new specialized role within companies called the developer advocate. So this is someone within your company that used to be a developer and now sells to developers. So they give away marketing that is not BSy, right? They build the code. They know how to build code. They know how to do things like developers would do. And then from a sales enablement perspective, it's your sales engineers. This is all the technical users that are then going into the field and giving more stuff, selling to them. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. And then once you funnel your messaging through this community, which is sort of like at the heart of the whole business and the whole go-to-market, then you have your content. And here I'll show you guys sort of how I did this for a launch that I did just a week ago. So first is the messaging. And I think, thanks for the water. So one of the important things in this whole thing is how do you bridge the messaging doc with the demo? And this becomes sort of like the deck that your sales team then takes to market, right? And the way I see success in this is when I see the sales engineers using this in their pitch decks, right? Many times what happens is that the technical users don't use the marketing content, they create their own. And to me, success is when I go and sit in a meeting and I see this slide being presented by a sales engineer. I'm like, okay, the content is great, they're willing to present this to the customers. And so to me, seeing this, in particular, we have a team called Machine Learning CTOs, which is like the experts in the field around machine learning. Every one of them has it in their deck. And so to me, it's like, okay, you were successful. And so as you can see here, and I think this is supposed to have, or not. As you can see here, what I did was I sat down with a PM and some engineers, and I mapped out the process of how you would use the product and the integration with this thing called Anaconda, which provides like Python libraries inside Snowflake. And all the value props were mapped almost in like a architecture in a way that it was easy for both get the value prop, what are the things that I get to get from this, as well as get the technical details, like how does this actually work, right? Because in my mind, which is sort of also how, because I was an engineer in undergrad, in my mind, I need to see the sauce. Like, you can't just BS me with words. I need to see how things work. And this is what engineers need to see all the time, data scientists in the case, which is who I sell to. And so this helps me put things together. So it's not just this crazy diagram that nobody knows how to map, which is way too detailed. It's not just a few sets of words on a slide, but it's sort of like finding that middle. And it becomes a really good way to make sure that your message gets across. In this case, right, I wanted to make it clear that there was one thing you could copy in two places and have consistency between the two, and you would always do it in a way that was secure, scalable, and all this other stuff that probably don't make sense to you, but makes sense to the people that I need to talk to. And so that, to me, is a really good way to make sure that, hey, you can bridge what is the messaging doc and the code, which in our cases are demos, which are really boring. You just see code. And so you always have to think about it like, how do we make this fun? And slides like this one help with that. So I talked about community. So where does the whole community thing come in? Well, on one side, we want to make sure the community can talk to each other. And so for most of these developer tools, what ends up happening is most companies will set up like a Discord server or a Slack channel, and that's where the community starts to grow. There's been communities that have grown into companies. There's one called DBT, super successful, turned a Slack channel into what is now a multi-million-dollar company, if not billion. I can't remember if they already became a unicorn. And so the important thing is that you want a place where your community can go hang out, ask questions, and get questions back from their peers. Because it's just like any other marketing, right? Word of mouth is the cheapest form of marketing, so how do you ensure that developers get quick and fast word of mouth, right? And so for us, what we do is we have these user groups of special interests. So within Snowflake, we have multiple user groups. I started the one for data science, and so what we do is like every week, every month or so, we talk about a specific data science challenge, who solved it, blah, 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 and it'll be from the point of a customer. And then customers also get to come and ask questions. The other thing is we have forums. So now that Snowflake is a pretty big company now, it's a public company, so we don't have to go back to a Slack channel. So we have our own forums where customers can go and hang out. But the important thing also is not just about code. It's also developers are sort of like fun and quirky and geeky, right? So how do you get them to express themselves in ways in order to build a community? And so one of the things that we started was a awareness campaign on social media, which is called full-time model. So in data science, the biggest challenge is data scientists spend too much time preparing data. And Snowflake's really good at crunching and processing data. And so the idea was if you spend less time waiting for the data to process so that you can train your model, then you get to be a full-time model. And so the guy on the left is our developer advocate, right? So he's the one that sort of represents the developer from the point of the Snowflake community. And so he led the way. This ended up being the most popular, the most engagement we've ever had on a social media post, right? This is a company that's 10 years old that has, and for some of you that maybe work in like larger B2C or companies like that, 12,000 likes is not really that much. But for a B2B company, This is a ton, right? Imagine like all the companies that you could be targeting by knowing like this type of content. And so we saw that being super successful, so what we started doing was, okay, we found a group from our community, we send them the same t-shirt and said, hey, look at this cool thing, we send you a cool gift box. If you like it, talk about something about Snowflake that helps you be a full-time model. And so what they would talk about was things that, hey, it makes me analyze geospatial data for my scooter company really fast. And that's how I get to be a full-time model. And so they posted something like that. The other one was similar thing. They were using our data sharing capabilities, and because they were using that, they were getting to spend more time to model, right? And so these are the ways in which we build communities without necessarily just like going always to the code, right? So the same way that the messaging was like, how do we make it not as boring as code, but not as fluffy as the messaging, bridge in between. And here is also the same thing, right? We need to bridge the code with the fun things about people, which our end user likes a lot of different quirky stuff. And so there's a whole campaign around this, so there's different type of posts that we did. This was like a catwalk, and then we brought those t-shirts to our conference last week, which happened here in Vegas too, so it was a lot of fun. And then the last thing is, what about the content that goes out, right? I think the era of the data sheet is almost over. There's no, the developers don't want to read the data sheet. That is too up level. It doesn't really help me figure out what the hell does your company do. So what I did for my launch is, this is a web page that has like a step-by-step guide on how to use the product. And so if you see on the left, there's like the feature is called Snowpark Python. And so this is a 7-step process that helps the developer get started with that. And this, once you go into like step 2 and all that stuff, that's where all the code is. But as part of that, I don't want the messaging to get lost, right? I want them to remember scalability, governance, performance, right? All those words that I think are super important for them to keep remembering. How does this actually work without getting too confused once I get into the code? And so embedding that, it's almost like I'm embedding this. And with that, I want to say thank you, and hopefully there's some questions that come around. And thank you for the water. Ah, cool. So any advice for a PMM transitioning to technical PMM developer marketing role? Yeah, so for example, at Snowflake, we actually don't have a distinction between technical PMM and PMM. I know some organizations do. But the way I think my role and how I exceed at it is that I get a little bit technical. Sometimes the PMMs don't get into the product. We have like badges for learning how to use the product. I got the badge, so I understand like what does it mean to start the product. I learned how to, I didn't build the demo, but I copy pasted the code and ran through the demo, because then I know that things work and all that stuff. So it's really, really knowing your product and feeling like even if you didn't know anything about it, you could help someone at least think conceptually how to get through that. And so sometimes it's like taking one basic SQL class, right, or some programming language class so that you learn some basic concepts, right? So if someone says, oh, I need to write a for loop to do this, or hey, I got stuck because I'm getting this type of error that says login error, server, what does authentication mean, right? You have to get really good at these like lingo that the developer would use. I have to get really good at what like a data scientist would use, right? If they say feature engineering and I'm doing this and then my K-NN model broke because of XYZ, right? So I need to be really good at understanding that terminology in order to do that. So I would say it's a challenging place to be a PMM because you have to sort of like continuously be learning, almost like if you were a developer, which is fun. And so one of the things that I really like is that it keeps me technically challenged. And so it's a really good, fun way to be a PMM. So you don't have to. I have a lot of peers that come from like English literature backgrounds that became PMMs. They just spend enough time in this world, and so they understand the personas and some of the technologies. They don't ever actually get their hands on it. But I find that it's what makes me differentiate myself in the industry. Similarly, other questions, if you don't have a developer background, what's the best way to learn the audience? I'll definitely say if you have a friend that is a developer, that's the best one. Hey, what do you do on a day-to-day basis? Like, show me when you open your laptop, what things do you do? Which cloud service do you use, right? There's like all these things that you could learn about directly from that user that they'll be super willing to explain, that I think it's usually the best way to do that. The second thing is you would want to talk to someone that's maybe been like a salesperson at a cloud company, because they totally understand like all the personas and everybody that they need to talk to, right? I need to eventually meet the legal team because I need to sign the contract. There's procurement. Those guys always get in the way and try to negotiate more than they should. There's like, right? And so if you talk to a salesperson, that's going to be, so you're two extremes. The salesperson, then the engineer that's on a day-to-day basis doing things. I'll say those are the two things more important there to know about that audience. For the community setup, how do you delegate on who moderates, facilitates? Yeah. So the interesting thing about the developer community is that I actually don't manage it. We have a whole team around community. As a PMM, I've been advocating for someone that does more data science, right? So one of the things I advocated for was, I want you to hire someone that has data science and machine learning experience, because I need someone to be able to do that. And so I can't give the best answer as to how to do this, but some best practices I've seen is have someone that does your community, like user groups, and then someone that focuses on forums, because those will take you enough time that you could have two separate roles for that. Of course, it may depend on your community, so always start with one person and then see sort of where the work starts to pick up the most. How did you measure success of the content approach? Yeah, so there's tons of content that came out. I think for the presentations, one has been, we finally got a content management platform, so we know how many salespeople are looking at the content, and so we've seen growth by using that platform itself. I think, to me, I always like just looking at those things where, like, if I jump in a random call, are they using the slides that I created? I think seeing that, to me, is the most successful metric. Anytime I jump in and I see a custom-made slide, I'm like, I'm doing something wrong with the way I'm explaining things, because it means that the users that need to explain it on the field to the end user are not really getting value from what I created. And so there's something that's missing in that. And so going through that, I think, is the most valuable thing in terms of metrics. In terms of content, we've just gotten into video. So one of the really cool things is that we've seen everything related to developer audience just jump 1,000+ views within the first week, which we weren't seeing before. And so now it's almost like if I don't see at least 1,000 views within the first week, it's like this didn't get enough, this is not getting promoted enough, whether it was through a blog or a social media post or something else. And so there's some like benchmarkings around video that we're doing. Right now we're only focused on YouTube. Started to explore, like, should we go to Vimeo, right? There's like all these other things that could happen. But for now we're focused on YouTube for that. And the third one is, which is the challenge right now, is we're measuring blog views and time they spent reading, right? That's, if you have all this technical content, you want to make sure that people are reading it. The challenge we have right now is that as we're building this developer audience, we're not actually bringing them to our page because they're already hanging out in other places. So we're posting all our content in other places. So one of the things that we're getting a lot of view or like traction as to what's happening, just anecdotal, we know from like Medium, we get some number of views and things like that. Medium is like super popular among developers as a place to go read articles on how-tos and things like that. And so we're doing a lot of posting there, so we're growing our audience there. And one of the things that we'll need to do eventually is figure out how do we now bring all these developers in that community into the Snowflake property. And so we'll do that. And hopefully if you ask one of the other questions, I can answer it after we do some networking, because I think I ran out of time.
Wonderful.